Alistair. To viewers, two things here. It's Wednesday, 19th of October 2022, and we have Alistair Aitken OBE, and Alistair is very kindly going to tell us all about drumming and his life in drumming. So just to kick it off, Alistair, you picked drums, or somebody picked drums for you, and you started to learn. What was the circumstances and who taught you initially?
Well, I came from a little village in Midlothian called Temple, and would you believe it, I actually started learning the pipes. But I was so young at that time that my fingers wouldn't meet the holes in the chanter, so I was later persuaded to become a drummer, and I joined the Borthwick and District Pipe Band, which was based, and I think still is actually, in Birkenside near Gorebridge, or part of Gorebridge, and I was taught by drum major Drew Hennessy, as he was known, and I played my first public engagement with the Borthwick Pipe Band at the age of 9 at Durrelton Galladay in East Lothian, which was the Saturday after the Queen's coronation in 1953.
My goodness.
So there's a little bit of information for you.
Aye. What about uniforms at that time?
It was a full uniform but no feather bonnets.
Ah.
Black hook feathers, but full uniform otherwise with the Royal Stuart tartan.
You never get folk using the black cock feathers now. I was in the Paisley British Legion when I started mid-50s, and they used the black cock feathers, and I understood at that time they're very expensive and rare and difficult to get.
I think they still are, but I haven't seen one for a long time actually. I used to have one and I can't find it anywhere. I think it disappeared when we moved house.
Sorry, that was a digression. Right.
But Borthwick Pipe Band was not a competing band, so I played with them for many years until I got married in 1963 when we moved to Curry, just in the outskirts of Edinburgh. And shortly after that I was persuaded to join the Collet and Curry Pipe Band at a time when they were starting to think about pipe band competitions, and eventually became the leading drummer of the band, and we had a successful competition record for quite a number of years, right up until 1973 when we were second at the World Pipe Band Championships at Ayr.
What grade was that?
That was in grade 3, and that was second to Lanarkshire Police Pipe Band.
Okay.
Which was Campbell McGugan at that time.
Very good band at that time.
Yeah. John Sculling was the leading drummer, believe it or not.
That's right.
I think the following year John went to Shotts, and I later that year accepted an invitation to be a guest player with Edinburgh City Police Pipe Band.
So that was 73,
That was 73, the tail end of 73. First year I played with the band was 74.
Who was the leading tip there?
At that time was a chap called Ian Watt, who had been the leading drummer in Collet and Curry before me. And we went on to win the World Championship in 75 at Corby.
That's right.
And by that time it had become Lothian Borders Police.
Yes.
The following year Ian MacLeod retired and Harry McNulty took over, and Bob Montgomery came back into the band, and I played with Bob for the next 10 years after that.
My goodness.
So I was 12 years as a guest player with the
Yeah.
police band. But
Who
initially, it was-
actually taught you what you leading up to before? Who influenced your drumming before you went to Edinburgh City?
well, obviously the chap who taught me in the first place, who was a very good rudimental drummer, he taught all his pupils all the basic rudiments, how to read music, how to write music, how to service drums, and in these days there were rope tension drums.
Yeah. And
And
who was this chap?
the drum major Drew Hennessy in Borthwick and District Pipe.
Ah, right, aye.
When I joined a Colin Curry band, Jim Hutton's father actually stayed across the road from us in Curry, and Jim came along to practices just after his big accident when he was in the Invergordon Distillery pipe band, and he was in recovery stage. So that introduced us to lots of Alec Duthart settings and
Yes, aye.
a lot of things that happened in grade 1 bands,
Aye.
which made the transition an awful lot easier. Jim went on actually to play with Edinburgh City Police
Aye, right.
after that,
Uh-huh.
for a couple of years along with Alec Duthart.
Uh-huh.
Then they both went back to Shotts.
Yes.
And that turned around with when I joined the Edinburgh City Police Band.
Yeah. So, what sort of influence on the drumming existed with the Edinburgh City Police Pipe Band? Was it very much on the influence of Duthart, or was there other influences?
The interesting thing was that Jim Hutton obviously introduced me to a lot of Duthart material, and when I joined the Edinburgh Police, they were still playing a lot of Alec Duthart material. And of course, Bob Montgomery played with Alec when Alec was the leading drummer of the Edinburgh Police Band. And Bob continued to play a lot of that material and adjusted some of his material to the same sort of style as well. So both these people had a major, three if you include Jim Hutton, had a major influence on myself.
Aye.
And that continued throughout my time in the police band.
Did you find over these years with the previous bands and then going into the Edinburgh City Police Pipe Band that you had to change your drumming style radically, or was it just quite a smooth transition for you?
Well, it was an honour to me to be invited to play with the police band, because I'd always been a strong supporter of the band when I was in Colin Curry and before that actually. And I thought it was going to be a major challenge to change, but I found it a lot easier than I thought it might be. Mainly, I think, because the Jim Hutton lead into it, and the fact that before I ever went to a practice, I was sent the music and was able to learn a lot of it before I went to the practice, and that helped dramatically.
Because in these days, you wouldn't have the access to recordings, sound recordings that they have nowadays.
Not to the same extent. No, there were obviously LP records at the time.
Aye.
But at that time I was never into that. I just had to adjust my style to whatever style.
See, John Walsh said that's how he learned band tunes, was listen to LPs.
Yeah. Well, I was always taught to learn by the music. So
John Walsh was not a great reader of music.
Well, that was an advantage I had with Drew Hennessy in Borthwick. He taught us all that. And he taught us about sounds and things as well. Although the drums we played were nothing like the drums now.
No.
But funnily enough, when Drew Hennessy died, he left a little note that there was a couple of drums that he had in his loft that he wanted to go to me, because I wanted them in the RSPBA museum.
Okay. Yeah.
And they were the original brass shelled rope tension drums that I played when I first joined. But he added a little bit saying that he taught me how to play drums. I taught him how to change drums to more modern drums because I persuaded him to get rope tension drums.
Yes.
And I thought that was quite interesting when he left that little note.
It's good that it's obviously thoughts that he had floating about his mind at that time. See, the drum corps, when you initially went into the police band, just for shortness here, how many side drummers did they have?
6.
6.
And usually at least 5 played, but
Aye.
at that time there were 6. And we
which-
never had any more than 6.
No, but that was a reasonable
That-
size
that-
at that
yeah.
time, because some other bands I think were still playing with 4.
Yes, well,
mid-70s, is that right?
We played in championships with 3 at
Aye.
times.
Yeah.
And I remember the first time I ever judged a Grade 1 competition was at Birmingham, and there was Grade 1 bands playing with 3 and 4 drummers at that time.
Yeah, and you'd only have a maximum of 2 tenors if,
Yeah.
at that
Well,
particular.
the police band never had any more than 2 tenors.
No, and not did any other band, I don't think. That was something we could maybe touch on, but that's about 30, 40 years down the line again, you know. So you enjoyed your time with the police band. Did they practice during the day or in the evening?
The Pipers practiced during the day.
Aye.
They had time off
That's
to
right.
practice. The drummers practiced at night. We
Because it was
practiced
guest
on-
players.
Yes, well,
Yeah.
in all my time in the band, there were guest drummers.
Yeah.
And before that as well. It was quite different from Strathclyde Police, who had the single band unit, and everybody were in the same unit and they were all policemen. But in my time, all the Pipers were policemen.
Right.
But there was always guest players. And,
It was funny because 15, 20 years ago they started to get guest players into Strathclyde Police as it was then, and they found that they had to change their band practices from initially in the afternoon twice a week to seeking evening practices to accommodate the weight
Yes.
of outside players.
Yeah.
And the whole thing changed quite dramatically, and I was never ever convinced that it was for the better.
well,
But against that, you've got the recruitment problems of all the police bands, just getting sufficient numbers on, and more. You're talking about the quality. What sort of difficulties did Edinburgh City experience with recruiting and quality and quantity?
well, I think the fact it was a much smaller force than the likes of Strathclyde, and that was a factor. I don't know what affected the drumming. Sometimes they had about 4 policemen who were drummers, but in all my time there was at least 2, sometimes 3 guest players.
Yeah.
But I never found it difficult with the practice schedule. We practiced 2 nights a week. There was no pipers. The pipers tended to come in about sort of late October, November, when they were starting to think about the following year's repertoire and play with the drummers. But the one thing in our time when we practiced twice a week, Ian MacLeod usually turned up and would play along with us and try and work on things that he wanted to do or he didn't like, or
Of course,
the drummer wanted to do.
there again, you're starting to think heavily at that point about the ensemble.
Yes.
Effect.
Yes.
So, what was the attitude towards that?
Well, the objective really was to try and find particularly a sound that matched between pipes and drums, and I think that showed with Ian MacLeod's band anyway, because the second year after the introduction of ensemble, the police band won the World Championship, and the year after as well,
Yeah.
71 and 72. they won at Lanark, then at Hoyk, I think it was in
Yes.
72.
Aye.
Then in 75 again. So out of the first 5 years of ensemble, Edinburgh Police Band, which essentially it still was in 75.
Yes, it was. Aye.
Was 3 out of the 5. So that says something.
Aye.
So
Very successful.
yeah.
How successful were in the other competitions during that period?
Well, I think the success rate was just about. It was always in the first 3.
Aye. Aye. So, who for reviewers' information, was vying for these top positions in the first half of the 70s?
Well, you had Shots and Dyke Head, you had Red Hackle, who else did you have? Glasgow Police,
Yeah.
and Muirhead and Sons.
Yeah, so 5 bands,
Yep,
very
yep.
strong bands. And at that time, Red Hackle's under Weatherson, is that right?
That's right.
Aye. So, very, very strong bands, and Weatherson had a lot of good musical ideas as well.
Oh yes.
You know, I think he was the first guy to introduce a church organ into
That's
a
right.
pipe band, LP.
And Wilson Young rolling on the bass drum and
Yeah.
all that sort of thing.
Yeah. So you had very strong opposition,
Oh, it was-
and so to come and top there, it was no easy task.
No, it was a strong 5 at least
Uh-huh.
at that time.
And reflecting on the experience you had as a judge later on, which we'll speak about, if you reflect back on ensemble judging at that time, first half of the 70s, was it difficult for the ensemble judges? Did they, how about their approach? Was it right or whatever?
Well, there was a controversial start to ensemble because the Pipe Band Association selected individuals from other musical disciplines, who were not pipers and drummers, and that didn't go down very well to start with. The piping drumming community didn't like that. And
So the wider community didn't like it,
No.
but it was led by the Pipe Band Association
Yes.
just
Aye.
to see how it go.
aye,
Hey, do you remember any of the judges' names or anything? No.
offhand
It
now,
doesn't
no, I
matter.
don't know.
Hey, I've asked other folk that near the same as us, they don't remember, because it's so far back anyway. But it was, I think that experiment only lasted a couple of
It was
years.
about a couple of years then they brought in
The pipers or
pipers
drummers.
or drummers as
Yeah.
ensemble adjudicators.
Yeah.
But over the years there's been quite a difference in interpretations of what pipe band ensemble
Was that
actually is.
led, the ensemble thing at that time, was that led by Shots and Dyke
John
Head?
McAllister.
Aye. Did the Shepherd have any? No, he was
Not at
later
that
on.
time.
He
Not
was
at
later
that time.
on in the decade, wasn't
No,
he?
that's right.
Aye,
yeah.
that's right. Yeah. So it was principally it was really Alec Duthart and John McAllister.
That's how it started.
Yeah.
And nobody knew what was going to happen
Aye.
in 1970 at that first
Yeah.
contest until they actually appeared on the park.
Yeah.
But over the years there's been a great doubt about the definitions of pipe band ensemble,
Aye.
and it still exists yet. There's still people who don't think it should happen. But it's interesting later on, which we might talk about.
Yeah.
I got involved in the project which led to the Piping and Drumming Qualifications Board, and we did a trial run of one of the things we were doing at the Army School, and we invited the Director of Music for the Royal Regiment of Scotland to come and give us a talk on what he considered to be ensemble.
No, to explain that to viewers, that would be not the chap in charge of piping and Highland drumming,
No,
but the other chap was in charge of
the military bands.
the military bands with the brass instruments,
That's right,
etc.
yeah. And the strange thing was that what he came up with was about 90% of what we regard as pipe band ensemble. The same sort of things about balancing sounds, balancing instruments, interpreting things the same way, all that sort of integration,
Yeah.
these type of things that we regard as pipe band ensemble.
Yeah.
So, there was not a great deal of difference in
No.
the interpretation.
It's just the folk how they perceive these things as judges.
Well,
And
like the
did
pipe,
they have sufficient personal education?
the pipe band world's got a habit of coming up with all sorts of different interpretations of lots of things.
Aye, because it's people that's run,
Yep.
unfortunately.
A bit like politicians.
So just to hark back and just so we can finish off the subject of Edinburgh City Police Pipe Band before we move on. You've got the second half of the 70s, Harry McNulty I think was still in charge and that sort of thing. How did the band develop, or did it start to go back a wee bit?
Well,
Is there any particular reasons?
it gradually fell away slightly, but still managed to stay in the top sort of 6 to 8. Harry had quite a bit of success, and he won the Scottish Championship, and then Harry was replaced by Colin Forbes, and that lasted, I think it was about 2 years. Then George Lumsden took over after that.
Yeah.
And they had reasonable degrees of success, and after George was Duncan Smith, who had a bit of success as well.
Yeah.
But it was always at that sort of level of the top 6 or 7-ish, that type of level.
I think they would start to experience recruiting problems.
Well, there was that, and the emergence of other bands, of course.
Aye, but because of the emergency
Yeah,
of
there
other
was a
bands.
whole lot of other bands started to appear.
Kemet.
And there was bands from overseas, Science Fraser
yes, yes.
University, St Nate's Fraser Highlanders. So they all had an influence in what happened to bands over here as well.
Yeah. And by the time the 80s come in, there was quite a difference.
Yes, aye. The whole competition scene changed with formations of medleys and that type of thing.
Yeah.
Probably more emphasis on that than on March to Spain Reel, and you could argue that the standard of March to Spain Reel sort of fell back a bit.
Yes.
But there was different types of medley performance, and that's still happening yet.
Yeah. Now, just off camera, we're talking about your professional life and how that might have started to impinge, influence, whatever, on your musical life, and just maybe help the direction of things. So can you maybe explain that wee bit?
Well, I was a career civil servant, so I spent 42 years in the Scottish office. The first half of it was related to the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries, and when I got to that stage of having been through finance, personnel management, and I was a staff inspector for quite a substantial amount of time as well. They don't have such things as staff inspectors nowadays. They used to call them time and motion studies. Maybe they need them now. I was told if I wanted to get on, I had to move somewhere into something different, and at that time I was actually in the police pipe band. So I suggested, I would quite like a move into the police division, and I was told, oh no, that's not possible, that's the most difficult senior executive post in the Scottish office, so you're unlikely to get that. And funnily enough, I found myself posted to it, and I found it one of the most interesting jobs I ever got involved in. What happened was, about 9 months after I moved, I was promoted, and I was told if you want to stay, you have to take on crime prevention. And that was at the time of Mrs Thatcher's interagency crime prevention approach, which you may have heard of in your police days. And it led me into all sorts of things that affected later on. I was still playing with the band for about 3 of these years to start with, and it became quite difficult. I was busy, I was working with the 8 police forces, and found it difficult to maintain my involvement with the band, because I always tried to play in police engagements as well as the competition scene, because the band couldn't play without the guest players actually.
Yes.
And we had all sorts of private, well, not private engagements, official engagements, like the.
What decade was this?
This was in the 70s.
Okay.
And the early 80s.
Right, okay, yeah.
Mainly the early 80s. But the police band had all sorts of things like playing along Princess Street during the festival for 3 weeks, and the Royal Company of Archers, High Constables of Edinburgh, plus they did trips abroad, and trying to cope with all that was quite difficult, although I managed it as much as I could. But what it did lead me into was I got involved in the review of the police promotion exams, which led me into the organisation called ScotVic, Scottish Vocational Education Council, because they took over the marking of the police exams.
That was funny. I was an invigilator in these exams for many years after I retired.
Right.
Over in Kilmarnock, so I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
Well, that led me into something that later affected the RSPBA. But where the other change came, if I wanted to progress again, I had to move again, which I really didn't want to do, because I'd been about 10 years in police division and I really enjoyed the job. But in the civil service, unless you move, you don't get on. So I found myself responsible for ScotVic, the vocational education policy.
Okay.
And that led me into the legislation which formed the Scottish Qualifications Authority. So I finished up my civil service career as the head of a unit in Glasgow, because Donald Dewar wanted a major department in Glasgow. The whole department moved through, and I found myself responsible for SQA, still vocational qualifications, and that led me into the project which became the Piping and Drumming Qualifications Board.
Yes, could you explain that?
Well, maybe we could cover that in the RSPBA side.
Okay,
better,
right, yeah.
Because there's a progression that led into these things as well. But the other thing in the police division, of course, was some of the things we did nationally, because it was at that time it was a conservative government in England and Scotland, and there was no Scottish Parliament at that time. So although the police service was devolved at that time, just like education was as well, we still followed mainly what was happening down south. So there was lots of things in the pipe band which I learned through my job that affected the police service. So that helped me again in the RSPBA. The other thing the police band did was it got me involved in teaching, because the band went to the Berlin Tattoo one year and I couldn't go because they were away so long I couldn't get time off my work, and I was sent down to West London because they had asked for somebody to help tune their drums for them, the West London District Pipe Band. And I ended up for the next 29 years teaching the West London District Pipe Band. So it's one of these things, you agree to do one thing and you end up doing something totally different.
Exactly.
But I also, when I was in the police band, taught the novice band at Craigmount High School. Bob Montgomery taught the juvenile band, so the two of us were involved there. Then I eventually came back and I taught also the local Boys Brigade band for a while in Curry, and eventually came back to Colin Curry band, and I spent the last 20 odd years teaching them as well, although the band just folded
Aye,
as a result of COVID.
aye, it's a few bands they
Yep,
folded
yep,
because of
yep.
COVID. Fortunately, not a terrific amount. I'm really impressed by the amount of bands that turned out to compete this year.
Yes, I was impressed as well.
Aye.
Um,
So, your story.
Aye, well, then of course, by the time I'd retired from the police band, I had become a drumming adjudicator with the Royal Scottish Pipe Band Association. And when I finally retired, that enabled me to become what is now known as an unattached adjudicator. So, that got me involved in championships. The secretary of the Adjudicators Panel at that time was John Ferguson, you remember, who was an ex-Edinburgh Police as well, actually. And when he died in, I think it was 1988, there was a new secretary needed for the panel, and two people put their names forward, not me. And then when they realised what they had to do, they withdrew. So there was a long harangue about who's going to take over the panel. So to make things easier, I suggested, well, I'll write the minutes of this meeting until you find somebody. And that ended me up as the secretary of the panel for the next 12 years.
Goodness sake, aye.
So just the way things go.
Yeah.
So that got me into a few things like the need for an adjudicator's code of practice, for example.
Yes.
That started at a contest that I was judging in England when there was 2 rings, and one of the teams, the drumming adjudicator, was in a suit rather than a kilt. And the president of the association at that time came to me and said, look, there's something wrong here. The 2 rings are running alternately. Could you judge in both of them? Because I don't think it's right that somebody should judge in a suit. And I said, well, if that's what you want me to do, fine. About 15 minutes later he came back and said, oh, forget it. This is, the headquarters know that he judges in a suit in contests in England, so we can't do anything about it. But I think we need to change that. So I had to raise the issue when I got back. Is there a rule about dress?
Aye, mode of dress for a competition.
And it turned out there wasn't. It applied to drum majors only. So Bob Nichol at the time, the executive officer, said we need to do something. So I put together a rough draft thinking it would get shot down in flames, and the panel actually agreed it. They agreed to supplement it. Then it went through the music board and the National Council at the time, and it became the code of practice, which still exists. That was the first thing. Then we got into areas like the changing of the points system to the placing system. Trial runs for that.
Aye, I thought that was a positive move, really, because the point system threw out a lot of problems over the years.
Well, the point system was, you could not prevent adjudicators from giving wide ranges.
That was it.
And you could have 6 points between first and second, for example, which dictated the whole contest.
Aye, because one judge could influence the whole contest rather than the 4.
Aye, and that's what happened. So we spent a lot of time piloting the placing system to make sure it didn't change the results dramatically. And it hardly changed it at all, so that has existed ever since. Then there was a time there was an adjudicators monitoring group, and all this time, of course, the adjudicators panel was the responsibility of the music board, because the panel wasn't seen as part of the association at all. We were regarded as employees,
Right.
Which we never accepted, because all the adjudicators had been in the association longer than most of the people in the committees.
Yes.
But it was always withheld any direct link to the association. So we had a monitoring group which the was set up in conjunction with the music board.
And how did the monitor, did they scrutinise the judges' sheets afterwards?
Well, it did that, and they also looked at complaints, and it was often difficult to actually find anything wrong because there was no actual evidence. But the monitoring group was disbanded for a main reason. It was a policing system. It picked on individuals. Whereas what we eventually introduced was a performance management system.
To try and make things generally better,
yes,
by suggestion rather than...
Where you had workshops and seminars designed to change things rather than point to particular individuals.
Yeah.
But the individual would get the message through that approach, which proved, in my time anyway, to be much more effective.
So it really threw back the emphasis on selection of the judges in the first instance and training of these judges after they've been selected. And if there was any faults, then you went back to training.
Yeah. Well, there was lots of changes made in that as well. There was no formal training group until about the early 90s, when there was the music board set up under John McInnes, who was the music board education convener at that time, a training group. I became involved in that about 2 years later, and people like John McAllister, Wilson Young, George Summers, who else? John McInnes, of course, and myself, Bob Shepherd. We were all in that group. By the time I actually left the association, there was only Bob Shepherd and I left, because everybody had sort of passed away or resigned from ill health grounds.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what happens now, whether there still is a formal group like it was in that day. But that was the start of the real rigorous adjudicator training. Then the next thing that happened after that was the famous Millennium review of the RSPBA in the early 1999. The association was almost bankrupt, and something had to happen. I was asked to be the chairman of a review which probably was the most comprehensive review the association has ever had. And we examined the whole organisation.
How many people were in that review committee, board or whatever?
There was about 7 or 8 in total.
Oh, that's quite large.
I was given the freedom to recruit who I wanted to the committee, and to whatever it would cost. And I thought that was a stupid move at the time. Because I could have gone to town and the whole thing. At the end of the day, the only cost was some travel expenses for one of the Northern Ireland representatives, and the rest of us did it all free of charge. That was our contribution to the review. The report was accepted in principle in the year 2000. Then an implementation group was set up. Then the whole thing fell.
Why?
I've never ever found out the real reason for that. A lot of the delegates at the AGM didn't vote.
Is this because they were ill-informed or not informed, or just had their own biased opinion before they even read the thing?
Well, I think there was more to it than that, but I've never really found the true reason for it. I like to think that a lot of people never read the report fully. It was a very detailed report, so I'm not sure that they fully understood everything in it. But over the years, quite a number of things have changed. One immediate.
But just reflecting back on this review board thing, it was quite a comprehensive report, you've said. Is there any, on reflection now, looking back with hindsight, is there anything you could have done with the report to make it simpler, or put out a précis that had been more easily absorbed by the lazy folk that tried to read it or whatever.
Well, the report itself had a précis. I think, maybe a lot of people never read the report at all. Maybe only the band read, secretary or something like that read it, I don't know.
This is the unfortunate thing about democracy, isn't it?
Well, I always used to think that about the Pipe Band magazine, that it went to each band member. Did the members ever see it? Because in my time in the police pipe band, I never ever saw the Pipe Band magazine. So it makes you wonder about that.
See, people, I know nowadays nobody reads a newspaper, and I wondered about the influence of the written word even 20 years ago. If maybe, see, I think that was a very important committee, very important direction they could have taken things in, no doubt. I wonder how much publicity extra publicity could have been given to this by way of explanation, delegates going out to band practices or going out to Glasgow or the other nodes and explain to the districts, here's what we've got here.
Not really, no. I think one of the fears at the time was that members of the review group wanted to become officials in the RSPBA. I made clear when I presented the report to the AGM that that was one thing that I got agreement on at the start of the whole project.
Nobody
would run for it. In actual fact, one person did run for chairman later, and because when I discovered that, I asked him to step out of the presentation of the report at the AGM, which he did, and so that removed that part of it. But I think the main reason was that a lot of people didn't understand the full report, or the fact that it made clear it was a blueprint that would change anyway as circumstances changed.
Just a skeleton, really.
And the main part of it was the organisational structure.
Yeah.
Because what we recommended was that there should be a board of directors with no more than 7 people on it, but 7 people who were expert in particular subjects, who I'm quite sure exist within the pipe band community, but they normally say, well, clear, because the board is so big. At that time it had about 19 members, and there's no organisation can really make progress with such a big committee.
It's like a Kirk session, that, isn't it?
Well, what we tried to get around that by recommending that the existing National Council at that time would become the trustees of the association. So they would still have a say, but the organisation would be run by the small board, which would be accountable directly to the AGM. And working to some sort of operational plan with timescales, action officers, all that sort of thing, like any other organisation these days do. I don't think that was fully understood. But a few things did come out of it. The executive officer post became our chief executive. Ian Embleton was chief executive throughout his time with the RSPBA. Our website was developed. The whole media side was improved. A media committee was set up. And I think that helped to develop the links with the Glasgow Council over the World Championships, for example. And one thing we recommended was that the association itself should run the World Championship. That didn't happen, unfortunately, because Glasgow Life runs it. And gives a grant to the association. If the association could do it themselves, all the profits would have gone to the association rather than Glasgow Life.
Massive profits, really.
But the other big important thing that did happen, but it took 10 years, was the company, it became a company limited by guarantee. And what a lot of people, I don't think, understood at the time of the Millennium Review was that the Constitution, under the Constitution, if the association went into debt, the members and the National Council were liable for these debts individually. Yes.
Aye.
And what the Company Limited Guarantee did was limited the existing board of directors to £1.
Yes.
So, and you know, it's a limited company, but it's a non-profit making or non-shareholder company, so that any profits go back into the association itself.
Right.
So that was one major change, but it took 10 years before that finally was implemented.
Well, you've just recounted there's a lot of good things that did come.
Well, I think over the years it did.
Aye.
I remember getting interviewed by Andrew Bertoff for his pipe and drummer site as it was, and I said at that time, eventually it will happen, but it'll be somebody else's idea. That's what will happen. But if that happens, fine. Right. So that was one major thing. And then the next major thing that happened was the Piping and Drumming Qualifications Board.
Yeah.
And that happened purely by chance. One of the recommendations in the Millennium Review was that all the piping and drumming organisations should work together on a common set of qualifications. But of course that fell with the failure of the whole Millennium Review at the end of the day. But one of the days I was walking back from RSPBA to Central Station in Glasgow to get the train home. I happened to run into one of the officials of the Scottish Qualifications Authority, and he asked if anything had happened over the Millennium, because he knew about it, because I told him about it earlier, and I told him the story, and he said, well, we've just been approached by another organisation wondering if we would accredit our qualifications nationally, but we're reluctant to do so because we know there are other organisations and it would not be in SQ's interest to act for one and not the other. Is there any way you could resurrect it? And I said, well, I don't know. I said, if you like, I'll have a go at the organisation you're talking about, which I did. And they agreed to at least discuss the idea. So I got Ian Embleton, after clearing it with the chairman of the RSPBA and the convener of the music board at the time, to write to all the organisations involved, which was the National Piping Centre, the College of Piping, which still existed at that time, the Pipers'Persuasion Society, and the Army School, all of which were in a group called the Institute of Piping.
Yes.
And they agreed to meet. The first meeting was the usual sort of, I don't know if this will work, the usual, there's all sorts of problems here, it'll never happen. But they agreed to have a second meeting, and we just gradually worked from there, and firstly developed a harmonised set of qualifications, which were launched in City Chambers in Glasgow, and I invited a representative of the SQA to come along to that and sort of challenged them to get involved, which he did, and it led to another set of working group with a consultant from SQA, which led to the current piping and drumming qualifications that are certificated by the PDQB and the Scottish Qualifications Authority, and that still exists. So
that's of great value.
Well, it's great value in this country and worldwide. Because
yes, absolutely.
You can take the qualifications in other countries. So that is one success. The one thing that didn't become successful, we also tried to introduce a pipe band studies qualification, because there is nothing around about how to create a pipe band.
Yeah.
Now, despite the fact that there's a Royal Scottish Pipe Band Association, you can take piping qualifications, drumming qualifications, there is nothing really official that tells you how do you create a pipe band, how do you run it, how do you administer it, how do you select tunes for it, because most tunes, pipe tunes, are for solo pipers, they're not for pipe bands.
That's right.
How do you tune all the instruments collectively, not just tune your pipes or tune your drums? How do you plan different types of performance? Is it a concert, is it a street parade, or is it a tattoo, or is it a competition?
Even a presentation.
All that sort of stuff. How do you meet what's described as pipe band ensemble? And we tried to develop that, but it got to a stage that we could not reach agreement, so it never happened.
That's a shame.
And that is a big shame in the whole thing. It was unfortunate because that could have been of considerable advantage. I also had ideas of trying to make the adjudicator training system into something that could be nationally recognised, and do the same for drum majors, and that never actually happened. But it didn't.
Alistair, do you think there's a future in that? I say that in the light of the amount of people that are gaining degrees in the piping and associated subjects, the RSPBA, allied to the National Piping Centre and various other organisations. These people are coming out, they're educated, and might be more perceptive, might be more in the listening mode when it comes to these suggestions in the future.
Well, it's possible it will all come back against
I
us,
think
given-
people are getting more musically educated across the board.
Well, I don't think there's any doubt about it. One of the things that we wanted in the adjudicator training programme was to try and involve other musicians more. Bob Shepherd was very keen on that, to try and get other musicians to explain how they would go about piping and drumming, for example.
Yeah.
And the one time we did it was during that course at the pilot course at the Army School, where we brought in the director of music, and it was interesting in what he said about the whole thing, and I'm quite sure that goes on in the Army for the Edinburgh Tattoo, for example, between the Army School bagpipe music and the military bands. I'm pretty sure it does. I think it showed in the Queen's funeral, for example.
Absolutely. The presentation is everything, really.
Yep. But one thing I've discovered, I got involved in the RSPBA's historical research group as well, which was a voluntary group set up, I think it was in 2006, by a former national councillor who's sadly no longer with us, Tony Harris from down south, and we did a lot of work on history, and it came to an end, sadly, because that everybody got old and gradually the group fizzled out. But what we discovered is that everything goes round in circles. And particularly in the SPBA, RSPBA. For example, they started off with two committees in the teaching mode. One was an advisory committee, one was a pipe band college. What happened was the same people became involved in them both, so they eventually merged it into a pipe band college. Then they ran into similar problems again, and they set up a music board, which still exists. Then what happened about 3 or 4 years ago, they set up another pipe band college. And sooner or later that pipe band college and music board are going to merge again.
And then
And that's a total
factions will say, no, we need to split it up.
and that is just a total circled as to what happened way back in the
Seems to
1940s.
run in cycles all the time,
Yeah.
aye.
So I'm pretty sure that all these things will come up again.
Because people are not interested, you say, the history of these things, and they don't recognise that mistakes were made in the past, and we shouldn't be making the same mistakes again. But inevitably, because of human beings, they will start making the same mistakes again.
Well, one thing I learned from my civil service staff inspector experience, which I mentioned earlier, was
Aye.
never change anything unless you look first at why was it put in place in the first instance, and is it still needed, and if it is, then consider the best way of doing it. And sometimes the best way of doing it is the original way,
Aye.
but never do it without looking back at the history. And if you look at developments in the pipe band world, in the Pipe Band Association in particular, most of them tend to be introduced without looking at the history.
Aye.
And it happens in government as well.
I think it's an inherent laziness of the individual. They just want to get into a meeting and make it half an hour rather than
Yep.
and make a decision, then move on. It's the next big thing or whatever. That's that problem solved, rather than take a wee bit of time and examine the problem.
Yep. No, I'm quite sure that some of these things will come back up again.
Aye.
Maybe not before very long. Some of them.
Is it too early to talk about the presentation of bands and circles and arcs and that sort of thing? I know
No.
you have some views on that.
That's been something that came up recently in Pipe and Press. I kind of started it off with a comment I made about your former pipe band, actually, which I find difficult to get my
Aye,
name now.
the Scottish Police and Federation Pipe Band. Aye,
yeah. Or Police Scotland and Federation, I think.
Aye, something like that.
Aye, it was just, it struck me when they marched in, it seemed a bit disjointed where I was sitting. And as soon as they formed the circle, it all seemed to come together. And I raised that comment. And I knew it would probably stir up something, because I know that the editor of Pipe and Press has argued for some time that it should be a sort of half circle formation.
Yeah.
And it did attract quite a number of comments.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, some of them favoured the circle. Most of them, I think, favoured the circle.
Aye.
But what I did, a follow-up thing on it, I mentioned that the RSPBA did actually have a pilot project. I think it was in 1998, if I remember correctly,
Okay.
of a half-circle formation.
Where was that? Where did that occur?
There were various,
So it just wasn't one location?
No, there was about 4, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
I got involved in the one at Badgate Highland Games.
Right.
And what I discovered was that there was no real direction given to the bands, adjudicators or anybody else about how it was going to operate. It was just left to, let's try and see what happens. And my experience was that the bands all formed up in different ways, and you got totally different sound projection. And I was actually ensemble adjudicator that day, and I couldn't get far enough back from the band before hitting the crowd to hear the full impact of the performance. And I remembered one band in particular had such a wide half circle that I could hear the pipe major and the pipe sergeant on the opposite side as though they were not playing together. There was such a time difference. And one band actually had the snare drummers facing backwards so that the sound was coming through the pipes. Then of course they lost contact with the pipe major and the bass drummer. So that didn't work. Then I also mentioned an experience I had in the Eastern United States Championships, where they tried an experiment with the bands on a stage, but the stage had 3 levels.
Okay.
And where that went wrong in my view was that the bands chose to do different things on the 3 levels.
Aye.
Some you had the pipers at the bottom,
Right.
the bass section in the middle, and the snares at the top. Others had the other way round, and again you get totally different sound projection. So for it to work, it would have to be, consistent.
See,
As far as I'm concerned.
in Brittany, I don't know, you've been
I've never been to Britain, no.
Aye, well, I've been to 2 or 3, and the Concours de Bagad is 2 events, indoor in a theatre like the Royal Concert Hall. It was in Brest for many years. I understand it's moved to Nantes. But the summer, that was in February, and the summer one is in August, and it's at Lorient. And that is in a football stadium, right? And they've got the grass covered by whatever because of an evening thing, but that's immaterial. They've got a stage set up, and the bands just walk, they amble across the intervening space. They've got a final tuning point away, a few hundred yards away, and they just wander through a herd of cattle, really, and then it take 5 minutes to set up for an 11-minute performance on the stage. But what is consistent about it is the bombards are over in the high level on the left hand side as you face them. The bass and tenors and stuff like that are in the middle at the high level, with the other percussionists just below that. And then on the right hand side you had the pipers, right? Occasionally we'd have pipers in each wing, but it was an arc, if you like, fairly consistent, and that was the stage. Now, set back from that, 13 seats were laid out for judges, 13 judges. So that, and he excluded the marks of the highest and the lowest, and that tend to give you less bias than what you would expect because of the numbers of judges. Well, and each judge pair the 2 judges for bombards, we'll say 2 for percussion, 2 for piping, whatever. Maybe 3, doesn't matter. But it was well spread out, and presentation come into it, and this, that, and the next thing, So it was all well covered. And I sat and listened to Brest one time, the indoor thing, and somebody said to me in the pub, what do you think? And I rattled off what I thought just off the top of my head, and lo and behold, I had it right. And it's about the only time in my life I've ever picked a prize list correct. I've always been well out. Anyway, they seem to have the whole concept pretty well laid out. As I say, you've got 5 minutes to set up, and then they just, when they're finished, and by the way, it's the overall director of the music is a bombard player, and he stands and conducts the band, and that's a focal point for all your musicians on the stage. So I think if you'd an arc, you'd really need somebody conducting the band,
just like happens in a pipe band concert.
Otherwise it's going to be nonsense, and leading to problems that you've alluded to,
Well, I think it could work if they all form up in roughly the same way.
And see, by the way, the audience was in the stand, in a straight line behind the judges, so they got to hear exactly, and there's nobody in the ground behind all the performers, and there was maybe 2,000 there, and that was more than adequate,
How would you do that at the World Championship?
Well, you need to go to a different location.
Or a totally different way.
You would need to go to Ibrox or Parkhead or something like that, quite frankly, to give you a sufficient space round about the stadium for tuning purposes and everything else, because all the bands were outside the stadium at Lorient, tuning up and everything else, and then they would come into the stadium. There was nobody tuning up in the environs of the within the stadium. it was just one band that you heard, and that was it.
Yeah. Well, see, I think it could work if you get something like that, and you have all the adjudicators in front.
Aye.
But will the pipe band will accept that, because somebody will argue they could hear the snare drums better from the back, so the drummer adjudicator should be at the back. I've argued for a long time that all the adjudicators should be sitting in the same position in front of the band, and they're all getting the same sound.
Here's the thing. Why do you have individual sections with an adjudicator, like a drumming judge and a piping judge? Why not the 4 pipe band judges?
Well, that's been tried as well. We tried it in a musical appreciation competition for grade 4 and novice juvenile bands.
How did that work?
It didn't. It worked to start with.
Aye.
But no, even we tried to train the adjudicators to be pipe band adjudicators, a sort of modified ensemble type of adjudication. And a lot of them were reluctant to do it. And it's since been phased out and back to the 4. 2 piping, 1 ensemble, 1
It's a shame that in a way, because you got certain, I know one leading drummer in my experience who was not interested in the pipe band performance. He only wanted to win prizes for his drum corps.
I know many like that.
And it always left me a bit cold, and I said, what's this all about? And
well, I've always argued it's a pipe band competition.
It is.
It's not a piping competition, it's not a drumming competition.
Aye.
It's a pipe band competition.
That's right.
So, for me, I would prefer all the adjudicators to be sitting in the same position. They're all getting the same sound projection. I would prefer it to be a raised platform at the head of the band, because sound goes up far quicker than it does travel at ground level. But I've argued that for many years, and it's never happened, and I would be surprised if it never does happen.
So in the meantime, we landed with the circle.
And there's another thing worthy of mention. We tend to teach piping in isolation and drumming in isolation.
Yes.
The RSPBA's always done that.
Yeah.
They don't teach the two together.
No.
Bob Shepard and I argued that quite a bit when we were trying to develop this pipe band studies qualification. If you teach them together, maybe they'll start to think of the combined band effect.
And the problems with the other section.
See, there are a number of piping adjudicators who are not ensemble adjudicators and don't want to be ensemble adjudicators. And we did have people saying to us, we find it difficult to listen to the two at the same time. Now, I don't know what you can make of that, but that is true. And I wouldn't mention any names, but that has happened in the past. So, the big issue is whether you want it to be a pipe band competition or what. You could argue that you could do away with the drumming prize. That would cause a rumpus just the same way as the best bass prize was taken away.
And the folk were trying at one point to get tenor drum prizes and all that sort of stuff.
Well, it used to be a best bass section prize. It was the bass and tenors, but that was done away with, and there was a great uproar about that. And the same would happen if you take away the drumming prize. But there are pipe majors who've said they've never won the World Championship because the drum corps was always looking for the best drumming prize.
That's right.
That's true.
And the pipe majors are sometimes at fault as well because they don't take any opportunity to understand anything about drumming. When they're setting out tunes and programs and medleys and this, that and the next thing. So
well, one of the things that we argued in the musical appreciation project, the MAP project as they called it, was that at the lower levels the drummers shouldn't just go and pick a drum score from one of the top drummers and try and play that, even though they couldn't play it or adjust it. What they should do is work with the pipe major to work out what is the pipe major's interpretation of each of the tunes,
Yeah.
and develop something that actually provides a musical impact, at the same time, incorporating all the basic rudiments.
And I think that historically, right from Ian McLaren onwards, all your top pipe majors always had good discussions with their leading drummers about the presentation and this, that thing.
Well,
And I'm quite sure your current world champions are doing the same, and Inverary, St Lawrence O'Toole, all the rest of them are very, very good at that. And Shots were also excellent at that in the past. Because I spoke to Matheson and Kilpatrick about that way back 12 years ago when I started this project. So if you want to be successful, really successful in producing good music, you've got to listen to the other guy.
yes. Well, I mentioned Ian McLeod, who always came along to practice, and he would pick out something he didn't like, and the leading drummer had the opportunity, or any drummer had the opportunity to say, well, that doesn't really go well with the melody. Can we do something different?
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure all the top bands do that. I remember, you mentioned Inverary. I remember the first time that I actually gave Stephen McWhirter first place at the World Solo Drumming was a hornpipe jig section. And the thing that struck me that day was Stuart Liddell and Stephen were playing as one. The sound gelled, everything gelled, and that to me was not a mistake. The same used to happen with Robert Matheson and Jim Kilpatrick. They were a double act. And all that to me was planned. And I never really was impressed with the solo drummers who picked a piper and hoped it would go well, because you had to plan that. And I'm pretty sure
often, as you say, the pipers picked up the Tuesday before the Saturday sort of thing.
Well, I've seen it done on the day. But no doubt the top bands of today all work very closely together. And Field Marshal, Inverary, Shots, all these bands are doing exactly the same thing.
One final point I noticed, I think you come up with it yourself. What's the purpose of a pipe band competition? Is it to test the playing or put on a show? Who needs to be influenced by the performance? Adjudicators or spectators?
Well, without a doubt in my mind, the whole purpose is a competition is to test out the standards. What's the point of it otherwise? If you want to have a public display, you can have bands, mass bands out in the park somewhere.
Or do a concert.
The competition is to try and test standards, but also improve standards, because those who don't win all think about how can I improve. And to me, that's the role of the adjudicator as well. The prime person involved in the pipe band competition is the adjudicator, because without the adjudicator there's no point in having the competition. And the adjudicators, to my mind, should be given some advice as well. They should not be just picking out the mistakes or saying poor tone, but good tone, bad tone, all that sort of thing. We tried to change all that in adjudicator training, and I think we were successful to a great extent, although it probably still happens to an extent somewhere.
Yeah. I think the last comment about somebody went to print on one of these sites was about pleasing the public with known tunes rather than poor quality tunes, this, that and the next thing, and
Well, I think you could translate that into pleasing the adjudicators with known tunes as well, because a lot of the tunes that some of the bands play now are just a group of notes and sound like an exercise.
Everybody I speak to says the same.
There's no melody to it.
No.
And the other thing, of course, is all the different.
It's a finger exercise.
And there's all the different harmonies and you lose the tune totally.
Aye, where is the tune buried underneath about 8 levels of harmony?
That's right.
Aye.
So there's that side of it. To me, the performance has to be musical, and there needs to be a strong degree of tradition in the selection of the tunes. But it has gone the way of the finger exercise quite a bit in recent years.
Unfortunately, and it harked back to the education, just because people have been educated how to work out harmonies doesn't mean to say they've got to use that education.
No, I think education has become much stronger now than it has even 20 years ago.
Yeah.
There's a lot of education goes on in schools.
Yeah.
The Scottish Schools Pipes and Drums Trust has done a lot of work in helping fund teaching in schools, and there's a lot more teaching in pipe bands now, I think, than there was in the past. Maybe what has disappeared a bit is the voluntary teaching, because a lot of the teaching in the past was done by people in the bands or associated with bands, with no remuneration at all, other than maybe the travel expenses. That has changed, I think, whereas a lot more people get paid for teaching now. But you can't go past the private schools for what they've done, George Wilson's College, George Heriot's.
And that'll bear a lot of fruit in the years to come, no doubt.
Yeah, well, if these players in these private schools continue in other bands,
and contribute back into
it's got to improve the situation.
Yeah,
and if the same could happen in a lot more public schools, that would help as well.
Alistair, that's quite a time we've been speaking this afternoon. Time's just flown in as usual, and it's absolutely terrific. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I know that the audience will have enjoyed it as well. And I must thank you very, very much for your time here this afternoon, and wish you the best of health and best wishes for the future.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you very much.